10. Okay, so hi everybody, welcome to this afternoon's Teach Me for the A-Level Islam, GCSE and more. Key Stage 3, just general interest in the teaching of Islam, Teach Me for the summer term. I'm really happy to welcome Ian to come and speak to us about teaching Sufism as an expert from RE today, but also working on resources at the moment around this. And an experienced teacher for, what did you say? It was just a short 16 years you did of teaching Islam at A-level.
Yeah, but this year would have been my 30th year of teaching. So I would
Okay.
have been teaching 30 years this year had I not left. So yes.
That is, yeah, exactly. So we've got many years between us all of teaching this to speak to us about teaching Sufism, which is something that came up from the last meeting that people said they were interested in. So if at any point people have, even if you're watching this back later, a topic, an area you want us to look at, I would try and find someone who can come and speak to us. But I would really like to welcome you, Ian, and let you share your screen for this afternoon's Teach Me. Yeah, so pop questions in the chat if you like, or perhaps you could unmute or raise a hand if that's okay with you, Ian. And like I say, I might be furiously typing, but it's because I want to tweet at the same time.
That's
okay,
fine.
So good afternoon, Ian.
Afternoon, thank you, Ruth. Yeah, as Ruth said, I mean, Nicholson just started working with RE today, September of last year. So really enjoying it, but it would be, I'd say, my 30th year. Taught A-level Islam for 16 years in the northwest of England, but have taught GCSE since I began my teaching career, GCSE Islam, in 1994. So I have been doing a lot with Islam and actually working in predominantly Muslim schools as well. So in fact, I was just saying to Ruth earlier, one of my last A-level classes, 90% of my students were Muslims. So it was really good for me to be able to do that one and really fired my enthusiasm in Islam, because I'm not originally an Islamic studies specialist. When I was at school, it was Christianity, and Christianity, living in deepest, darkest Derbyshire. Never met anybody who wasn't a Christian, really, until I went to university way back when. So what I want to do today is really talk to you about Sufism, give you some teachings that you may want to use with students in the classroom to inspire them. I'm going to be asking you to think about some of the resources, some of the teachings, some of the texts that I've used in teaching Sufism. It's been one of my key loves to teach Sufism for the past many years. And as we said, I'm just in the middle of writing a Key Stage 3 Sufism resource for RE today as well. So that'll be something interesting. But I want to start off with this quotation from Rumi, which I think is a really nice one to get children and students start thinking about what Rumi is saying. Rumi is so key in talking about Sufism and explaining what Sufism is all about. So I just want you to read this quotation from Rumi and maybe pop into the chat for me, maybe give you just a minute to do so, because I want you to put things in. And as Ruth said, recording this, what do you think Rumi here is trying to say about his view of Islam as a Sufi at that moment in time? What do you think? So just pop in the chat for me any ideas that you might have, or even open up your mic and talk to me. I hate these courses sometimes when nobody speaks to me. You know, I'm sat here in my study thinking, please, I'm not bad, really. So any ideas what Rumi means here?
Do you know whether he wrote this, he said this sort of later or earlier, or is it kind of a sort of reflection later in life? Or
it's a reflection early in his later in his life, Ruth, after he'd gone through his understanding of what. Yeah. So once he understood himself what Sufism was, and once he'd looked at some of the teachings, and he'd come up. This is post, say, that I am. This is post the reed and the reed bed. This is really quite later on for him to think about this one, about how he saw Islam going forward.
I'm going to put something in the chat, but people can unmute if you want to speak about it. Yeah.
Talk to me. That's fine. If not, I will carry on in a moment. I'll just wait. I don't want to have these quiet bits in your recording, Ruth.
Marwa, just so you know, it's about Sufism, so it might be useful for you for revision, but yeah. It's also a teacher meeting, but we've opened it up to students as well, because students have found this really helpful in the past. So if you just want to sit there, you can join in or not, but if you are talking about Sufism in your Islam A-level, then this will be amazing for you to join in with and speak about in UCAS interviews and things like that you've done it. So please, you're very welcome, Marwa. Yeah, okay, great. I think, is this saying something about expecting religion to be something that changes the world, but actually maybe religion is more about an internal thing.
It is very much that. It's this idea of his new knowledge. So if you're thinking about the idea of, and I often use this in relation when I'm teaching to William James's idea of passivity, ineffability, noetic quality, and transiency. So bringing that synoptic link between the philosophy papers and the Islam papers is the idea that this is new knowledge that Rumi has gained, that he'd seen Islam as simply being about his reaction to the world around him and how he interacted with the world rather than how he interacted with his own internal self. And so the idea here for Rumi is really clear. The idea of the internalization of knowledge about Allah and therefore that reaction to Allah rather than accepting what's been taught by the Muslim law schools at the time. It's about internalizing your own thinking about Allah and taking elements of the Quran. And I used to do a lot of teaching here around the Quran al Takwini, the Quran al Tadwini, from the idea of we can see Allah through a holy text, through revelation, but I can also see Allah through reason. And the idea of the Quran al Takwini is a form of reason that I see Allah everywhere around me within the world as a Sufi. So everything contains Allah. I'm really bringing that out for students when you're teaching to them. And I always used to say to my children, how many Qurans are there? And obviously, I always used to get, there's one, sir, there's only one Quran. And I said, no, there are two. And I used to have a lot of discussions with Muslim students who'd never really heard this before. And it's actually a very 12th, 13th century idea that if we look at Surah 43, Surah 43 really talks about Allah in creation and seeing Allah. And that by me reflecting, or by Rumi here rather than me, obviously, but by Rumi reflecting on what he sees outside of himself, he really is understanding that one we see out, what we see in the world is Allah himself. It is the word of Allah. And for those students, Marwa, Rooster said there, you are a student. A really nice way for you to write about this and for students to evaluate this, and it's what we were talking about earlier, is this idea that actually, even if you don't understand the revelation, you can reason out what Allah wants for you and your relationship to Allah by looking at the world. And as I say, Surah 43 is really key on that one. And I know I'm going to send this presentation on to Ruth later. I've actually included a piece of work a 12-year-old girl has done on Surah 43 and this quotation from Rumi, which is really deep about how Sufis recognize, because of their sheikh, because of their time as a murid, as a student, they recognize this. It's a really nice way into Sufism, that it's about seeing in yourself Allah, but also therefore seeing that you are part of that creation. And very much goes with the Sufi poetry around
Is
read and the
is
river.
that this is just going to test my knowledge? Is that the verily there are signs for those who consider them
Yes, it
quote?
is.
Yes, I
Yes,
love
it
that.
is.
So Marwa, that is 43. Oh, I should know the precise verse. Is it
I,
19? Is it 19?
well,
I
let's,
always call it the verily there are signs. And actually, I was just thinking of you, Edward, in doing AQA. You know, this sort of general revelation versus special revelation, and Gloria as well at Morpeth.
yeah,
I
Yeah,
use that quote all the time for that, about there being in general revelation. Sometimes I compare it with the
yeah.
the quote from Paul in Christianity. That I'd never thought to put that with Rumi. That's fantastic. I love that. Yeah, I'll find it and I'll pop it in the chat, the precise quote.
I'm
Yeah.
just looking for it and I can't find it myself, and that's really annoyed me because it's one I use so much. That's one I've used with students, but it's a really nice way in to think about how we see the world in that sense as well. And then
I was
getting to go on, sorry.
no, just a couple of thoughts. So maybe because I got covered on the brain and did that for GCSE this morning, but this idea that everything that happens is a result of this inexorable will of God, and so it's actually no point trying to change the world because it's not under our control. That's
Yeah.
God's decree governs that. Whereas the only thing we can change, and even then, this time it gets a bit slippery, is our intentions, our effective response to God's God's world. The other thing that struck me was some of the arguments for the existence of God, the design arguments, and also I think uh, my read of Aquinas and natural law, the idea that the world is a revelation of God. The world is speaking. I guess is what you just said, Ruth. But the world is speaking. The world is is itself a communication from God, just as the Quran is.
Yeah, and what I tend to do there with that with the children is then explain about using the Muslim creation story about how Allah has created, and that is part of that one. And going back to natural law, trying to explain to students the idea that Islamic natural law is very similar to Aquinas' idea, but the idea is that actually God is not, therefore, in Islam, in that sense, he's designed the world and let it go off there. He can intervene, he can change the laws of nature if he wants to straight away and intervene at any moment. He just chooses not to. And by our reasoning, what Rumi is talking about here, and the Quran al-Takwini, we are then able to understand that. And the idea is that, why Muslims will say inshallah will link really clear into this one. If we look at the story of Hodja going out to plough the field and not being able to do it because the plough breaks and everything stops, because Hodja's not said inshallah, and his wife said, if you said it, it's the will of Allah. Allah will decide what goes on. You have to see the pattern within the world to do that. And in a couple of slides' time, we've got a really nice quotation from Ibn Arabi, which is quoted in Martin Ling's book. I know it's a rather old book now of What is Sufism. It's there. It's been used many times. You can see how often it's been used. And I found it really interesting that one of my ex-colleagues who's been helping me with some quotations for a book I'm writing actually says she goes to Martin Ling's as a Sufi Muslim to find ideas out. And I thought this was really interesting that, that the people within the community are actually using that work there to do those. So that's a really nice way in. It was something that was a revelation for me to understand that would come forward as well. Yeah. I will look for it later on as well. It's on another slide, Ruth, so I will get it out to everybody. That's fine. I mean, I then get into the idea of what we mean by Sufis with children. So very much talking here about the knowledge they will need in the introduction to an essay about Sufism and where the word comes from, but there is no agreed translation. Now, I don't know if you've all been watching, which I found really, really interesting, the pilgrimage in North Wales, the BBC pilgrimage in North Wales. And there was a really interesting comment on there of somebody saying, well, it does say within my faith that, to go to China. And the idea is this idea of, it will reach as far as China. Now, if we're looking at Sufism, Sufi scholars around people like Ibn Arabi, etc., have always said that Sufism is nothing new, and they regard Prophet Muhammad as the first Sufi. And what they're trying to say here is actually when they talk about China, it's about that oneness of the relationship with Allah. It's about the mystical side of it. So this idea of mysticism within Islam is absolutely key. So really Sufism doesn't really have a translation or a meaning because for people like Arabi and for Lings, it's not something that's recognized as something that was distinct from Islam at the beginning. Thank you very much for the quotation. There you go. As at the beginning of Islam, it was just a common part of it. And only during the Umayyad dynasties and the Abbasid dynasties did Muslims move away from the mystical union with Allah that Sufis would argue is reminiscent of the relationship Prophet Muhammad had with the Prophet. And only later on did we come to talk about Sufism in that way, which is why there's no real understanding around what Sufism, the word itself, literally means. So we can have, for example, so there's the idea of Safa being purity. It's the purity of your relationship with God. But Mark, if you're writing an essay, this is a really nice way in around trying to explore what Sufism is, but getting children to understand that it doesn't really have a true translation as such because it was an integral element of Islam until the expansion of the Muslim empire later on. Also, the idea of the coarse wool clothing worn by people, the suf. Okay, and we're also within there the idea of this group of people who are known as the Ail al-Sufa, and they were the poor companions who didn't have the material belongings that some of the early Muslims did within the first nascent Muslim community in Medina just after the Hijrah. But the idea is that they were engaged in constant remembrance, the idea of zikr, and zikr being fully important for a Sufi Muslim, that it is about that constant remembrance of Allah. And therefore you can link it into fitra, you can link it into taqwa when you're talking about the idea of Allah consciousness. We're talking about this idea that we are born with the desire to worship and to remember Allah for Muslims. And really nice here for a lot of students to extend their understanding is that links really nicely to the idea of why somebody would revert to Islam, not convert to Islam. because you're born with that desire to worship Allah already. And therefore, it is that movement to the constant remembrance of Allah and what Allah is saying. So really, really quite a nice one to include that idea of what Sufism is, but making it very clear that it's not, it was an integral element of Islam. And then that's why Sufism came later as a distinct element within Islam, that it was something that was never seen as being not a part of, I don't want to use the word everyday Islam, but traditional Islam, or Islam at the time of the Prophet. And if you're looking at Jahiliyyah and the days of ignorance, you can talk about the mystical experiences and the mystical reflections that the people, the early companions, the people they would have met in terms of their understanding. So I used to do a lot of work with my students for many years around looking at how influences had come through the Silk Roads, the trade routes, and how a lot of the trade routes came from the Hindu Kush. So they came from a very mystical Eastern, going back to the idea of China we talked about earlier, understanding of religion as opposed to a much more Western form of religion from the Byzantine Empire towards the north of Arabia at the time. So a really nice way in. But I really like this quotation with children as well. And it's something that Lings talks about in the introduction to his book. It's actually on page 1 of his book. And he says, "Enter me, O Lord, into the deep ocean of thine infinite oneness." And the description here is that Allah has sent out the revelation as the tide comes in onto the beach. But then actually the Sufi goes back with the tide back towards Allah to attain that oneness with Allah, to attain that understanding with Allah. So really using the imagery then of the beach and the tide, that Allah has sent out divine revelations over time, and not just the Quran, linking it to the previous prophets of Musa and Isa. He sent out the message to the people, but their reaction is the tide going back to be with God, to get a greater understanding of it. So when we talk about the infinite oneness, it's also a really nice way. And Ruth was talking about the idea of evaluation. This quotation is really nice to explain that Tawheed is still central to Muslims and to Sufi Muslims. Yeah.
That is brilliant. That thing saying oneness there, that idea that it's not either or. It's not, oh, you're either supporting Tawheed or you're Sufi. I think that's, brilliant.
And you've just reminded something there of systematic theology there in my final year at university, Ruth. So when you're talking about Paul Tillich, I remember it well.
I'm just trying to, I'm always thinking of how it connects to, for us with OCR, the other people,
It goes very much for the concept of the ground of our being.
Yeah.
The idea of concept of the ground of our being and the oneness there as well. So it's a really nice quotation from Arabi to explain what he's actually saying here about what Islam is as well. And Ibn Khalid al-Khaldun also saying here is this idea of the oneness. So taking away and looking at the time and thinking about this worldview really of Sufis within Islam in the 14th century, when we have got Islamic Empire, we have got this expansion of Islam across Europe into Spain and Iberian Peninsula. But the idea is it's not about the world. It's actually about, worshipping alone, that your own individual relationship with Allah is what a Sufi is aiming for. And I think this is a really nice way of exploring the idea of what really is the core element of it. It's your personal relationship with Allah rather than the community. It's your own way. And when we're talking here, and Khaldun is talking about the finery and ornament of the world, abstinence from pleasure, wealth and prestige, you can really, as your students can, so Marwa, here we go for you as well, you can really then link it into the idea of that idea we talked about of an ascetic earlier, but making it really clear evaluatively for children and for students, when they're writing, is the idea it's not a form of monasticism, that it's not the asceticism you see within Christianity, that actually this part of Islam is very much you are in the world, but then it's about your personal relationship with God, because you can't have an understanding of what this is like if you are outside of the world. And so that is a really key way of bringing those into everything there. But a really nice quotation, the idea of that my own relationship with God. Yeah, literally. So Sufism's not a set, Mars, but then no. The idea is that It's this connection with Allah. Okay, so you will have, Marwa, the idea that my friend Farine, who I've taught with for a very long time, I think, we went to the Freud Museum. You can tell I did Educast when you're doing Freud. We went to Vienna, and she regards herself as a Sunni Sufi. And so the idea is that she regards herself as a Sunni Muslim. However, Sufism is a key element of that, or that point within it there as well. And so the idea is this is what it's about. And in fact, Edward's put a great comment there that the founders of Sufi orders were married. And the idea is, the expectation is that actually, yes, Sufis will, if they've been through one of the Malevis, whichever group they belong to within Sufism, the idea is that once they will go into I hate the word normal life, but they'll go into a normal everyday life. It's not that you are fully away from the world. You have to be in the world. But then being in the world helps you overcome the nafs, and that then helps you on your journey towards fana. So the idea is that you are living within the world very much, and I've often explained this to my students, and they've really got hold of this, that in Buddhism, when we talk about the lotus flower, and the idea of the lotus flower sitting on the water has to be rooted within all the rubbish and the detritus at the bottom of the pond in order for it to flourish, in the same way a Buddhist has to be part of society in order to see what they're overcoming, in the same way a Sufi, therefore, to understand how and to use the mental agility and mental abilities to get over this attachment to certain things, they have to be within that society. And that idea of that aloneness, one relationship with God, really then links into that understanding of Surah 51. The idea that I created the jinns and humankind only that they may worship me. The idea of worshipping is that idea of zikr, of remembrance, and really making it clear to children here, this idea that, Sufism is encapsulated here. In Surah 51 is an encapsulation of Sufism, that actually our aim in life is to remember God, to focus on God. So as he said,
do you know what's the Arabic term there that's used for worship? Is it in the Quran? Or maybe I'll have a look. I'll have a look and see.
I can't remember which that is, but
whether that's interpreted differently by different groups. Oh, thank you, Ibadah. Okay.
Because that's what I'm saying is if we're looking at some that evaluative point, is saying how else would a Muslim interpret this?
Yeah.
So other Muslims have interpreted this. Sunni Muslims who are not Sunni Sufis will interpret this as saying they may worship me through their actions, so through the 5 pillars. For Shia Sufis, and there are very few Shia Sufis, but there's still an element of Sufism, looking at the actions around, the teeth loss, the idea of the 10 actions that all Shias must do. So it really is encapsulating the idea that it's a different reading of the text. And that's why when we talk about the Sufi community, that's why I would link this into the idea you have to have a sheikh to be able to teach you this one. The sheikh is the one who teaches you as you will read how you would move forward with that one. But the idea is it's that soul element of, do I mean worship in the form of zikr, and all Muslims will accept zikr, or do I mean worship in form of the action? Which one is more important? And if you're doing that evaluative commentary within an essay, that's the key point for you to be able to argue. For a Sufi, it's about the remembrance of God. It's about zikr, it's about remembering God in everything and becoming solely focused on Allah. Whereas for a Sunni Muslim, the worship there will be around zakah, salah, som, hajj. Whereas actually, yes, they are an element of Islam, but the element of Islam for the Sufis much more around going back to this personal relationship with God. And that quotation I used from Rumi, today I am wise, so I am changing myself. I'm moving away from my exterior actions, which are still an important part of Islam. But for me, there are other actions that will help me get closer to God in that sense. And so the key things really talking here about what is the theology behind it. So using in an essay for students, Surah 51, using Surah 15, using things like the story of the hoopoe, excuse me if I can pronounce hoopoe right, but using the story of the hoopoe bird, using that concept of the light in the niche, and saying, what does this mean theologically? How is that different how would a Sunni Muslim view that differently from a Sufi Muslim? Absolutely key when we're talking here about what we mean in terms of Islam. Talking then about the role of the sheikh as the teacher and the leader of the tariqah. And the idea is this is a person who is you are following his path. And that links very much to some of the quotations I'll use shortly around and from within the Quran about how we talk about whose path you are following. So the sheikh is teaching you in order to do those ones. So making sure all of these are in, far too quickly there. The idea of zikr, remembrance, reflecting on the nature of humanity, like Ibn Arabi's done, looking at the Quran al-Takwini about the tide and the infinite oneness that Ruth talked about earlier. Absolutely key. Talking about Rumi's reflections, and then Rumi having to explain and explore his reflections through poetry as a way into an understanding that moves it beyond the Quran. And Rumi putting those ideas forward in those as well.
Ian,
Yes.
I probably know the answer to this, do all people who sort of follow Sufism do the sort of master disciple thing of having a sheikh that they follow, or do other Sufis sort of take some of the principles but not have that aspect? I know that's one of the questions we get in OCL sometimes.
They will do. It was a really interesting program. I'm going to show how sad I can be, but it was on one of the History Channel, not the History Channel, but they were talking about Sufis who lived on the Silk Road. And because it was a much more transient community, they were following ideas of Sufism and developing it for themselves. And so it was actually talking about a group of Sufis who were using very much around the idea of self-harm to overcome the pain. I was exactly the same. It's not a form of Sufism I'd ever come across before, but they were talking about that some of the Sufis there were using self-harm through putting pins and knives through their cheeks. So sort of here in that way. So the idea is that they could then control their bodily desire to remove it, so that therefore they would focus solely on God, and that the body then became very much
that sort of split. Yeah.
that dualistic split of body and soul, and therefore by controlling the body you were releasing the soul to do more. Now that's a form of Sufism that when I investigated I found really strange. It's not one I've come across before, and it wasn't one where there was a sheikh involved.
Okay.
It was simply something that I think because it being on the Silk Road they'd come across influence from other religions, especially Catholicism, actually, in that sense, as well, from the Byzantine Empire, of the body, of the corporeal being evil and therefore needing to be controlled. That was a really interesting form of Sufism. And regarding them as Sufis as well, which is something I know other Sufis who follow the more traditional paths would not actually do in that sense either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I thought exactly the same, and there's just put there possibly sheer influence, the idea of the flagellation at Ashura and the feeling of persecution could be a key element of it. But they were not identifying. It was really interesting. They were not identifying as either Sufis or Sunnis. They were just identifying as a group living on the Silk Road in that way as well. And then the concept of the aesthetic of giving something up, of moving away into a society led by a sheikh in your tariqah and really doing those ones. But key ideas then, and you will have come across these are words that your students will be using, the idea of the inner path, which is given by the sheikh, the tariqah, and exploring that and explaining what this would mean and where it comes from. My students used to have great issues with I'm going to be honest, with the Malevi group and saying, well, is it really Islam? Well, actually, it's that idea of the inner path that you are following, that the Sheikh has given you, and understanding that reality, hakika, is the true nature of reality. That actually everything we have in this world is transient, but what's not transient is our relationship with Allah. That's why we must remember Allah. That's why we must follow the route of the Sheikh, the tariqah, to gain that understanding of what Allah is truly like. And for me, I found it quite interesting as well for students then to say, well, what role does the Quran have? Because the Quran is the Sharia. And in fact, reading this weekend, or this week actually, somebody saying that Al-Fatiha is a prayer, and Surah 2 to 114 is the answer to the prayer. And the idea of guide me in the straight path, here is my straight path. So if you're using that evaluative comment, Al-Fatiha, which talks about the oneness of God and guiding me. Well, actually, how would a Sufi understand that? They would take other elements from Surah 2 all the way through to Surah 114 and say this is what it means for them. But I found that a really nice way of understanding the Quran. Guide me, there's my answer. Well, actually, my answer is much here about the Sharia of the Sunni Shia Muslims, but actually there is another path, the Tariqah, and getting children to write about was a really key thing, I think. The difference between the Sharia and the Tariqah, because that really goes back to this idea of Rumi's commentary, Ibn Arabi's commentary, Surah 51, Surah 50 will go in there as well. Really might also, and I know we were talking about one earlier, Surah 43 really fitting into that one as well, that actually the reality is the Tariqah is really a parallel path to the Sharia. And that's how Martin Lings actually describes it, that, the majority of Muslims will follow the Sharia path. However, Sufis will follow their Tariqah because it will lead them to a true understanding of reality, rather than reality being blinded by rules and what you have to do in relation to worldly elements. It's about the spiritual one. And then talking about remembrance, we talked about zikr, about obliteration, the obliteration of the wants, the desires, very much talking about this idea of they are stopping me reaching God. And I think that's where you really get into that Buddhist influence on Sufi theology and really linking the two together. So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Ruth put there. So, yeah, Tariqah complements rather than conflicts with it. Yeah. So the Sharia law is there within the Quran. However, you will get from that really the overriding concept. And it was Esposito's commentary that Prophet Muhammad's message is uncompromising monotheism. So once you've got the uncompromising monotheism from Esposito, there's your Sharia. However, in order to fully understand the uncompromising concept, going back to Ibn Arabi of the infinite oneness, the idea is your Tariqah will lead you to that more than reading Surah 112, more than looking at some of the other the surahs around the oneness of God, really reading in that sense and saying this is how we would go forward with it.
Can I just chuck in an idea about some of the hadiths? So,
yeah.
There's the hadith of Gabriel, which is quite well known, where the prophet Gabriel comes to the Prophet Muhammad and asks him to rehearse what is Islam, what is Iman, and then what is Ihsan. So I think among the Sufi inclined people that I've come across, they tend to see that Sufism is a discipline for the Ihsan bit. So Islam is your outward actions governed by the Sharia, and then you've got Iman, which is your faith in the unseen. That's your assent to the oneness of God, the reality of prophethood, and so forth. But then Ihsan in the Hadith, Muhammad says to Gabriel, well, Ihsan is to worship God as though you saw him, because even if you don't see him, he sees you. So it's almost like a combination of the two. So the Tariqah then is you need a discipline for your Iman, for your faith, which is kind of speculative theology. Then you need a discipline for your actions, which is the Sharia, which limits what you can and can't do. And then you need a discipline for your inner life, which is how to integrate those two together. So once you're worshiping God as if you saw him, right, now that's Sharia, you're worshiping God as an outward action. As if you saw him, that's your Iman fully realized. And that's what the Tariqah is trying to attain for you, is this integration of those aspects of the religion. So the Tariqah is like those children's books where they've got a head of an animal and a body of another animal and a feet of another animal. You can flick them round. You know what I mean with those things?
I do, yeah. I mean, I've just put on the screen for you there, Edward, actually, the Hadith of Gabriel.
Oh, cool.
One of the things I used to do with the children is actually, I'll go back to what's going on, but I used to say to children, can you find me ibadah? Can you find worship? Can you find akhlaq here? Can you find iman? Now where's Ihsan? And getting the children to identify where it is, and then for them to be able to use that when they're talking about what Prophet Muhammad hears. But it's a really nice way, and if you're teaching this, that also brings in the concept of jihad. So if you're trying to bring in the concept of jihad, and my children used to have this absolute hilarity with me because I'd get really wound up if they missed out things like jihad of the woman that Amina Wadud talks about with, this is not my Islam. I love jihad word, but I also bring in the jihad of the Sufi. What is the jihad of the Sufi as a form of jihad? And I'd bring that out through the Hadith of Gabriel and saying, you know, what would jihad from this text here, what would jihad be for a Sufi? And then the idea is, and I'll just bring this one up and I'll go back to what I was looking at. Me. The idea is it's the internal struggle, not the external struggle. So I talk about jihad of the hand, jihad of the word, but actually then saying, well, actually, the jihad of Sufis is an internal struggle. So we could talk here about jihad of the heart and make that relationship between the different forms of jihad. The jihad of the heart, which some Sunnis and Shias will talk about in terms of the greater jihad, is actually much more around their faith. Whereas what we'll end up with actually, therefore, for a Sufi is this idea of the internal struggle against egocentricity. And that's a really nice concept for students to think about, the idea that we're moving beyond ourselves, we're moving it into doing everything as though Allah is there, watching us, Allah is there with us, Allah is part of us. And I really like Junaid's quotation there that I used to love the children using. When they used it, I'd go really, really happy. And this is one of the times, Ruth, when I will blow my own trumpet, that actually in 2004, I got the top 10 marks in the country in the A-level Islam paper. And the question was on Sufism. So I was like, yeah, that's fine by me. Thank you, kids. I think my lowest mark was 93% that year in the Islam paper. So I was like, yeah, it was one of those big things. But they loved this quotation, dying to oneself and becoming resurrected in oneself. And really does go back to that idea you were talking about Tillich's ideas of the ground of our being, bringing in that philosophical concept. Really absolutely key there. And Junaid of Baghdad is absolutely central, I think, in talking about the idea of Ihsan within the Hadith of Gabriel and saying, actually, it is therefore about what it's about being resurrected within God, within the oneness of God. So you can bring in Quran al-Takwini, you can bring in Surah 51, but you really bring in Surah 50, that Allah is closer to you than I am close to people, or Allah is closer than your jugular vein. We are closer there. The idea is that oneself, we are part of God. And then if you bring that into the reed poetry, the reed is plucked from the reed bed. I'm dying to oneself. I want to go back to that one self of God. I want to be resurrected in it. And when students are able to talk about the imagery of Rumi in relation to people like Junaid of Baghdad, that linking is really, in my own syllabus, my own assessment criteria was really that band 5 answer, bringing all those key elements together, really was. And I also love the same one, also from Junaid of Baghdad, the powerful is not he who conquers people, but he who conquers his self. What do we mean here by ego? And when your children are bringing those links, my children used to get really interested in looking at the idea of, very good, some of my students, in bringing in the work of Jung and the Jungian archetypes, and then bringing in this quotation saying, actually, even though Jung's writing in the 20th century, actually it's reflecting a Sufi thought from the 10th century. So the idea is it's very much Sufism is part of that archetypal understanding of Jung, and then comparing that, and what do we then mean by the archetypal or the understanding of ego by Freud. So they were really into bringing together all those synoptic links, worked really, really well. So if I just go back to what I was looking at earlier. So you end up with, there we go. There are things like this one, and we have already created man and know that his soul whispers to him, and we are closer to him than his jugular vein. What does this mean? So going back to the idea of, as Martin just said, the idea of the Hadith of Gabriel, bringing that one in, the idea of, we are close to him, the jugular vein. What is the Sunni understanding of this? That Allah has created us, and getting children, therefore, to understand it's not Imago Dei. That my children used to get so hung up on Imago Dei. It's a Christian idea. We are not created in the image of God, but God is there, part to you. Yeah. So brilliant, Marwa. Yeah, lovely one. God is closer to you than your own body. That actually we are part of that creation. We are part of that one self. We are part of God's revelation, as Ibn Arabi said earlier on about being part of the divine, the infinite oneness, in that idea of we're part of that revelation through our own creation by Allah, through Prophet Adam, and therefore we are part of him. He is part of us. And if we can get rid of, and this is what Rumi starts to talk about, and what the Junaid of Baghdad are talking about, if we can then get rid of the elements around us that move us away from recognizing God within us, we can hear him within us. So that symbolism, the idea God is whispering to me, and I can hear him if I take away all the elements around me, about what is moving me away from God. So it's like, I might be sat there and, I've got my lovely cup of tea because I'm thirsty, but actually controlling that. And the idea is focusing then on God and using the shake to do that is an absolutely key element of moving that forward, and using the shake to do that one. But that's one where a lot of my students would say to me, who were lots of Sunni and Shia Muslims, it just means that Allah created you. No, there's more to it, that Allah is within you. And some of my students then could also talk about the concept of Brahman, because if you ever look at the trade routes, a lot of the early trade routes came from the Hindu Kush. So the concepts of the Dharmic religions were really influencing the development of Sufism, and Sufis were speaking to the Hindus. And when you get into, if you go into Islam and you look at the role of the Mughals in India and the Muslims in India, if you're looking at the history of it, and this idea of how some of the Mughal leaders actually took on Hindu ideas and built those into.
Do you think that might be part of the kind of, I don't want to say backlash, but the criticisms? This idea that it's moving towards shirk or polytheism or bid'ah innovation. It's sort of seen as sort of merging the two traditions.
Yeah.
And that was part of what the challenge has been to Sufism.
It is, because because people have become more aware of the Dharmic religions, they've become more aware of the teachings, they've seen the similarities more as they've understood it, and therefore said, this is not Islam. When in fact, Rumi and Ibn Arabi argue, this is Islam from the beginning of Islam, because Prophet Muhammad had that one-to-one relationship with Allah. And therefore, when Shias talk about this one, and especially if they're using the idea of Surah 33 in the Ahl al-Bayt, the family, and Shias will say, well, also then Ali had the same relationship with God as Prophet Muhammad did, or a very similar relationship, and therefore the Imams after him, whether 5, 7, or 12, whichever ones, had that one-to-one relationship with Allah. Therefore, Sufis say, well, that's what we are aiming for, is that similar relationship, to get to know what God wants from God himself. And they would often argue, and I think this is where I used to a lot with my students, use Amina Wadud's quotation. She says, this is not my Islam. And Sufis often regard that Islam is not one core idea, but there are different ideas within Islam. So
I like to use Karen Armstrong saying Islam is not a monolithic faith. It's not just one, here is Islam, there is difference and diversity within it. And I use the quote that, and I should know where it's from. Oh, I should know, now I feel bad. 48 maybe. We've made you into nations and tribes, not that you may despise each other, but that you'll know each other, and that diversity is there. Even in the Quran, it says it's part of the, you could say it's been there from the beginning, this diversity. Yeah. Sorry, I'll let you talk. I keep butting in, sorry. I've got so much to say.
It's fine. If you use I think it's the Pew report on Islamic identity around the world, they actually talk about British Islam is not just one thing, it's many different things under one root or one roof, and therefore really nice. And what I'll do, Ruth, is when I send this through to you, I'll send you that quotation as well. It's a really good quotation. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a really good quotation for children to be able to use in that sense. But I also bring in this surah as well. And this image is it's one of our own resources. So I'll say this, it's an RE Today resource called PIPIM. So it's picturing Islam, picturing Muslims. But this idea of trying to separate the light from the dark is very much this understanding that you can't do it. You can't separate light and dark in the same way you cannot separate Allah from the universe he created. He's an integral element of it. Surah 24, Ayah 35. So the idea is that, if you have a lamp within a niche, the light is not just within the lamp, the light is everywhere, and Allah is everywhere, and you have to recognize that. Now, when I speak to non-Sufi students about this, or non-Sufi friends of mine, they will go, no, it's simply saying that, Allah guides everybody to the light. It's like, yes, but actually the idea is, yes, he's guiding you towards the light, but everywhere is Allah. You just need to recognize that even within the darkness, Allah is there as well. And that Allah is in everything. That comes really nicely through Surah 24, Ayah 35. And this image is this idea, it is an image based around that surah that's been understood there as well. You know, and you get there either, it's located neither to the east nor the west. That Allah is in everything, that Allah is everywhere. And that really goes back to that, I have to find it now, but that Arabi one, the infinite oneness of Allah is everything. Now, I know you were talking then, Ruth, about why people reject Sufism. If you think about the concept of Brahman in the Hindu Dharma, we're getting some very clear correlations between the two. And so in terms of, you know, Sufi ideas, it's a really interesting way to think about this one, that Allah is in everything. And it's moving around that one. And it really was one of the things my students absolutely loved looking at this quotation and saying, well, actually, now we understand where this comes from. And I love to combine that one, to get my notes together, with the following surah, so do the other way around. There we go. I am near. You know, when my servant asks you, O Muhammad, concerning me, indeed, I am near. What do I mean here by near? For the Sufi, God is here with us, that immanent personal relationship with God, really much around that and understanding what we mean by immanent. Now, I used to really get my children to understand the difference between immanent with an A and immanent with an I. And they used to get so fed up of me going, it's immanent with an I or it's immanent with an A. Yes, but you've got to include the idea that in Islam we have both here. The idea we have both here that is really, really important for you. That Allah is in the world, but Allah is also for a Sufi within me, and I have to hear that voice. Let's go back to Surah 50 and the idea of the soul is that part of Allah whispering to me. It's the soul that is dragging me, is drawing me back to want to be with Allah. It's the soul that gives me Allah consciousness. And that idea again of the duality, which really links nicely into when I was watching that program at the Sufis on the Silk Road, about the soul having that importance, really, that the body does not. And it's the body that needs to be controlled because the soul is that which has come from Allah and is the important bit. And the children I used to teach there were really, really interested then in the concept of how Adam was created and the idea of Adam being created from the soils of all the countries of all the world. And then God gave the ruh into him. So really getting to understand the concept of ruh here it's the ruh is going back to that which it came from. And the ruh symbolizes that element of Allah within you all, going brilliantly to the poetry of I am the say that I am the reed, really getting into the poetry there of those ones as well. And the idea is that I respond to the invocation of the supplicant when he calls upon me. So actually, this concept of zikr is an invocation of the Sufi, and then God will respond. So that personal response between the Sufi and Allah through zikr, really getting to that, and then saying to me, they will be rightly guided. And when we're looking at the idea of rightly guided, I'm not talking here about the four right guide, the caliphs, the Rashidim. I'm not going to talk about that. It's about being rightly guided by your sheikh, that you are guided by the sheikh to follow the tariqah that he has followed, that he has understood, that he has said will help you understand what Allah is, help you become that personal relationship with Allah in there. It's not really a master in that sense. It's more of a teacher. So the idea is a sheikh is somebody who's attained fana, and therefore they are educating you in the way of how you would do that. I think, Mar, when I try to explain it to children about the idea of a master slave relationship, that becomes too difficult, whereas a teacher student is a better way. The teacher is passing on their knowledge that they've gained. They're passing on how they've understood it and what they've come through with it. And therefore, they are passing on their wisdom. And the good way to think about it is they're passing on the wisdom of their tariqah to you. And it could be that actually during your lifetime, you have many sheikhs. Whereas actually, if you think about the concept of master, for me, it's very much around the idea you have one master and that's it for the whole of your lifetime. A murid may go to different sheikhs and go to different schools within Sufism and follow different tariqah in order to find the one that gains them their understanding of what Allah is actually like and how Allah will actually those. And that goes very much with these two quotations. And these are ones that are really short. So it's really good for you, Marwa, to remember these if you want to quote them, because you know what it's trying to do with your students. But ask those who know if you know not is actually used by Sufis to say, this is why the Sheikh is important. And that's why Surah 31, Ayah 15 is exactly the same. They will use these as the importance of the Sheikh. It's not that they are your master, they don't control you. They have more knowledge than you do about what Allah is and about that relationship with Allah. And similarly, the path of him who turns unto me. That one's used by Sunni Muslims to say it's Prophet Muhammad. You follow the Allah Sunnah, you follow the way of the Prophet. And very much the idea of when we talk about early Islam, shortly after the death of the Prophet in 632, we're talking about the Sunnah. The Sunnah actually becomes the way of the Sunnah, the way of the people, the family of the Sunnah. That's where Sunnis will say that's why we follow the path of Prophet Muhammad, which is why the Hadith and the Sunnah are so important. Shias will interpret this often saying, well, actually, no, this is where the Imams will come in. So they can combine things like the Ayat al-Kisa, the Hadith of the Kisa, and say, Prophet Muhammad took on Fatima, Ali, and Hussein Hassan under his cloak and said, protect them, they are my family, link it to Surah 33. And Shias will say, this means we follow the Imams. And that becomes a really nice way for students then to understand why there's a third part of the Shahada for Shia
Yes.
Muslims.
I never knew this quote for talking about the Imamate and in Shia Islam.
Yeah.
I always used 33 and the Hadith of the Cloak and Ghadir Kum, but I didn't know this one was used in that way by that's amazing. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
And it's really nice, Ruth, because I was talking today, because I use the word Shahadatain. And one of my friends went, what on earth are you talking about? So I had this long discussion about the Shahadatain is an element of the Shahada. So for Sunni, there's two. For a Shia, there are three. And when we get to the idea that Ali is the Wali of Allah, the understanding there that he who turns unto me, looking then at the meaning of the word Wali and what does Wali actually mean in that sense as well. And really interesting to say how we can link that in. But I know that's about Sunnis and Shias, but also.
So this one verse, 31:15, could be interpreted in those three different ways.
Very much
Follow
so.
the path of him, the Prophet Muhammad.
Yep.
Follow the path of him, Ali and the Imams. Or follow the path of him, your Sheikh.
Your Sheikh, yeah. And so therefore, if you're trying to use an evaluative way,
Yes.
how do Sufis view the Quran in that sense? You're trying to say that one, they will take it and they will interpret it in the way of how it will lead them towards Fana through their tariqah. Whereas a Sunni and a Shia would not. And a Sunni and a Shia would argue that actually this is them placing, and it goes back to this idea of, and I think it was mentioned earlier in the chat, we'll then go back to the idea of why Sunnis and Shias will not regard Sufis as true Muslims, and we'll look at the idea of shirk, because it's placing a human without divine powers onto a different level than the rest of humanity, when in fact humanity is all equal. And the Prophet himself was just a man chosen by Allah, and the Imams had special knowledge from Allah, and we can talk about the Shia Islam. The idea is the tariqah the Sheikh here then becomes above humanity, and that for some people is shirk, and that's why some Sunnis and Shias who don't fully, or people outside Islam who don't fully understand the concept of Sheikh will say, is this not placing them above everybody else? No, it's not. It's just the fact that they've turned to me, they have this knowledge, therefore they're trying to pass that knowledge on to you so that you can follow my tariqah in the same way.
A little bit like some of the misconceptions or challenges placed to Shia Islam.
Yes.
That's what's happening with the Imams,
Yeah.
Would maybe some other Muslims say it could mean, I don't know, someone who's just got really good understanding of Islam? Okay, I'm gonna we might say, I don't know, Tim Winter, or it would do, I don't know, she's female, but would other people, they could interpret it like that, I guess, as well, couldn't they?
Yeah, it literally is. And if you look at when you look at the Muslim law schools, and some of the Muslim law schools will use some of the ideas around this one of saying, well, actually, Wahhabis, Hanbalis have interpreted this as our interpretation of the Quran. This is the path you follow that will take you to Allah for your group. And when you're trying to talk then about the different law schools within Islam, which is a really key part of it, this becomes a really nice way in as well. And it's using the justification from the Quran in a way that a lot of Muslims would use it, rather than me as a non-Muslim, but as a scholar of Islam who's studied Islam a lot through 2 degrees, looking at this and saying this is what it actually links to. But it's a really nice way in that one as well. Right, so I'll just move on. So the idea of, we've got this idea of the sheikh, the idea of passing on this idea of behavior, this idea of actually even and this goes back to that surah we've just looked at, Surah 31, for Sufis, even being in the presence of the sheikh, you gain understanding of the tariqah. So it's not just what you're taught, usually through a prayer session or a study session. It's also by being in the presence of the sheikh as the murid, you are then able to gain an understanding of what it is to follow that path through. And really, that's the idea, that by being with the sheikh, you're remembering your tariqah, and links very much to this. And this idea that, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about Sufism being an integral element of Islam. And this is what, Fashanji is saying here, that today Sufism is a name without a reality. It was once a reality without a name. So to him, Sufism is the heart of what Islam was at the time of Prophet Muhammad. That actually the Prophet was engaged in trying to overcome the non-Muslim world around him, the days of ignorance. He was trying to focus in to remember at all times Allah. And if you're then using with your students and you're teaching about this one, the Dustur al-Medina, and the idea of, so me too, I'm with you on that one, Ruth. But if you're using point 23 of the Constitution of Medina, it says refer all items to Allah and his Prophet. So if you can combine the idea that actually even within what is seen as the beginnings of Sharia law, the Constitution of Medina, you've got point 23 is always go back to Allah, remember Allah, think about Allah, and then go to the Prophet. And if the Prophet is then like your sheikh in terms of a Sufi order, you then have this understanding that actually the Prophet will guide you to Allah and Allah will guide you to himself. So I usually talk really nice with my students about how the Constitution of Medina was nascent Sharia law before we really had Sharia law. And therefore, if you look at the quote, that point of it, point 23, it really brings it in together. And by focusing in on Allah from Constitution of Medina, but also from this one, and it's another short one for you, so be happy with that one. Hearts become tranquil through the remembrance of Allah. So through zikr, you understand what God wants. So you refer everything in your mind to Allah. So you're always going back to zikr. And then you've got there as well, oh, you who believe, remember, repeat the name of Allah with much remembrance. So always going back to the one thing you always do is always go back to Allah. Allah is at the center of everything. So no problem. I understand that one. Well, that's fine. But you can see here that, the Quran is then used. So remember, repeat the names of Allah. We can talk there about how Muslims will use prayer beads. They'll talk about salah in those. But what you can also then say was actually that's how a Sunni Muslim or a Shia Muslim interpret this. How will a Sufi Muslim? It's about remembering Allah throughout the day, going back all the time to what Allah has said. And that's a really key element of being able to do that one. And, and that I think for me is absolutely central to that understanding of Islam. And then that really goes back to the concept that Ed was talking about earlier of Ihsan from the Hadith of Gabriel. And this idea of, inner faith is more important than anything else. That Ihsan, that inner faith in deed and action. And I use that phrase a lot. The idea of the deed and the action is absolutely central to this. Really is key in that one. So I've looked at those ones with you as well. And then talking about here, the primitive nafs. So when we talked about a moment ago, the idea of dying to oneself is then encapsulated within the nafs and the primitive nafs. And this is where you get that really good synoptic link to philosophy and the idea of what we're trying to overcome. Where do these come from? These are born with us. And it's a really nice way in for students as well then to talk about science and Islam. And the idea that actually, we are born with the desire to survive. We are born with the desire to keep going. And actually, maybe not these, but we have these base understandings. But actually, what makes us then different from the animal kingdom is this element to get beyond them, this element to reason. And students really then can bring this in with the concept of the ruh again, and the ruh wanting to get back to Allah. So pride, greed, jealousy, lust, backbiting, stinginess, and malice are base desires that we all have. But actually, we can use our reason to move beyond them. But therefore, in order to do that, we have revelation. So the Quran revelation, Quran al-Tadwini, will move us beyond these. But actually, I've got to internalize it and move them on from myself to do this. And that to me is a really, really nice way of thinking about that one. And I'm going to move through quickly through the next ones because I know that Ruth will be able to send these to you. But you have then things like all the different nafs with quotations. And this is one I love this one, the one I really will think about with you for a moment. Rather than looking at the Quran, which I think is great, I love Rumi's quotation. The nafs has a rosary and a Quran in one hand and a scimitar and dagger in the sleeve. So actually, yeah, this is what he's saying. I might actually be saying, look, I'm such a good Muslim and amazing Muslim, but actually, at the back of it, I'm not. At the back of it, I'm still giving into the primitive desire. So I might portray to the world that I am the perfect Muslim, but actually, what's more important is my desire to be worshipping God and to actually focus in on Him rather than what I'm getting out of this. And moving through the stages of the nafs to do that one. And, the idea of, the self-accusing nafs, I swear by the reproaching soul, oh, look, I'm not good enough to be near Allah. That's not about Allah, that's about me. And so getting children in your teaching to understand that we're moving away from ego, we're moving toward Allah. Absolutely central in these ones as well. And then we have, things like the inspired nafs. The idea is a good deed must be done immediately. Look at one's acts with contempt. Yes, I've done something, but actually, who have I done it for? Have I really done it for me, or have I really done it for Allah? And, this used to be really interesting to teach. And if you're teaching this to students, you suddenly get a group of Muslims in your room going, we know Muslims like that, sir. We can see those Muslims in our school, that they will come in wearing the jubba on a Friday. They will say, I need to pray in the hall, and they make a big song and dance about it. That's not what it's about. And so actually students begin to realize the understanding of Islam then is more spiritual rather than the more physical idea. And that really goes back to, and I know that Edward mentioned earlier, that the hadith of Jibreel and the idea of the ihsan, really getting to do that one. And I love that one from Abdul Muttalib. One must keep one's acts secret, otherwise people will praise one and it makes you self-righteous. And what they're trying to say here is that self-righteousness and doing a good act so other people can look at you moves you away from Allah rather than moving you towards Allah. Whereas actually, if you think about, a lot of Muslims would say, I'm performing my acts of worship because they are taking me on my Sharia to God. God commands that I pray 5 times a day. I mean, just on a side note, I'm having some very interesting discussions at the moment about Hajj. Now that Hajj is a lottery and you get chosen at random by a computer, is that not gambling? That's a really nice thing for children to think about, because they've limited the number of places now.
Oh, I didn't know that. Is that like since COVID type thing, or?
Yeah. To limit the number of people going, Ruth, you now have to apply, and they then pick your name at random when you can go. And I think it was 3,500 places from the UK. That's it per year. And I've got friends of mine who are Muslims who said, right, we're not going anymore because it's relying on chance in order that I go. It's a form of lottery. I am gambling on going or not. That is not part of my faith. But yes,
it's very interesting. I didn't know that.
there's now a list on the Saudi Arabia website of saying how many places there are per country for Hajj, for people to go on Hajj, and you have to apply. So it's actually,
I hope there's a lot of robust checking of like how random. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, I'm going to find out about that. Yeah,
it's really interesting because, on the side note, very not what you do, but it's also causing a lot of issues with Muslim travel agents, because they used to do all the checking and anybody could go. Now you can't.
Yeah, there's a whole industry, in all sorts of pilgrimages, isn't there? I'm near Lords here, so I know there's a big industry that's involved in people.
Well, I used to live in Blackburn, and I used to drive down through Worley Range, and I was a member of the Lancashire Council of Mosques Management Board as their education officer for a while, and I used to go past all the Umrah and Hajj travel agents, and they've all gone now. So the Umrah ones are still there, but the Hajj ones aren't. So, but that's just a side note for you. And then getting into the idea of the nafs at peace, the please nafs. So I'll send those around. One is pleased with whatever comes from Allah and doesn't live in the past or the future, but now. Because if I'm continuing to think about what's going to happen, I'm not seeing the world around me. That idea of remembrance, that idea of zikr, with seeing everything in the world, seeing the minutiae. I know where you say I live in the Cotswolds now, so I've certainly moved from the northwest. And I like to look out outside my window. I have pheasants walking up and down the street. I have that, in that sort of area now. But the idea is that actually living in the moment, I see more. I'm not remembering the past. That's not an issue. I'm not remembering the future. I'm living here and now. And that's what I mean by the pleased nafs. That I'm pleased with whatever Allah gives me because it helps draw me closer to Him. Really nice way into that one. So, yeah, I don't think I'd make a very good Sufi as well. I'm going to be honest there, Ruth. I've just seen your comments as well. Man is at peace with himself. And then the pure nafs is when one is in full agreement with Allah. So the idea is that, I understand my relationship to Allah, as Allah Khani says. I realize I am part of Allah. Allah is part of me. I am part of Allah's universe.
Are these like the steps that people are going on?
They are, yeah.
And so it's the journey that you're going through to kind of reach that destination that your master has already reached, or your guide.
Yeah.
I suppose I'm thinking of it like a guide.
Yes,
it's almost like a pilgrim on a guide. So they've reached that, and you're making your journey through this, and it kind of gets deeper each time. Okay.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I would teach it with is the story of the hoopoo bird. If you've ever come across the story of the hoopoo bird, which I have here at the Conference of the Birds, and the idea is, and it relates directly to Dawud and Suleiman. Excuse me, because Suleiman talks about, and he actually says here, "Oh, people, we have been taught the language of birds, and we have been given from all things. Indeed, this is evident bounty." So the idea is that the birds represent us. And the idea is that the birds are going from where we are, and they want to get to the Simorg. And the Simorg is, and it's mentioned within the story of Dawud and Suleiman within the Quran, the Simorg is akin really to a phoenix, but it's not really a phoenix. And the Simorg is literally, really then, it's a mythical bird from Persian culture. And a lot of Sufism came from the idea of Persia and the areas of the influence there. And what it's saying here is the fact that the hoopoo bird says to the birds, who should be our ruler? We need to go and find out who our bird should be. So we need to go and find out the leader. We need to go and find out the Simorg, because the Simorg is the most intelligent of all the birds. And what happens is the hoopoo gets all the birds together and leads them on a journey over 7 valleys, which link very much to the nafs. And this is a really nice way in for children. So Valley 1 is basically the valley of the quest, where you get rid of dogma, you get rid of, unbelief, you get rid of belief. You are starting the journey as a pure new soul, and you'll get everything that comes on with it. So you're getting rid of the idea that, this is, doing my prayer, doing my forming my salam azaka is the most important thing. Actually, no, it's a journey I am making. Yeah, very much so. And when and I'll send this one to you as well. But the idea is that concept of 7 being so important, the tawaf, as you say, the circumambulations of the Kaaba on the Hajj, really interesting. The second one is some birds fall away because they fall in love. And so the idea is that the love for a fellow bird makes them stop in Valley 2, because they're no longer trying to find the purity of existence. They are more bothered about that personal, physical love. Valley 3 is knowledge. So the idea is that some people can't say that they get so entrenched, some of the birds become so entrenched in what they already know, that for them to give up that knowledge is so difficult, they can't do it. So they stop and they live in Valley 3. And that, for the understanding of the Simorg and the understanding of the hoopoo, is the idea that some Muslims are so attached to the Quran as the word of God, and that interpretation of the Quran of the word of God, that they feel safe, that if I do what my law school tells me, I will reach God. It's basically, Valley 3 is really Sharia. I'm so wedded to my former Sharia. And so they stop there, but those birds stop there. Valley 4 is where they begin to see that reality vanishes. And Valley 5 is they realize through their teacher that everything in the universe is interconnected. So that idea of Allah's infinite oneness is Valley 5. And then the Valley 6 is this idea of, and it says here, quotation really is, it's the valley of the beloved. We become perplexed. We've got so many questions that we want to know the answer to. So we've left behind all our earthly desires. We are totally seeing the relationship with God, but we're not part of that God. And then the 7th value is the end of self, the annihilation of self. And the idea is, in the story, the birds with the hoopoe bird try and find the Simorgh, who is the mythical bird, and all they find is a mirror. And they realize that they have been the Simorgh all along, that actually the answer to everything is within them. And they just needed to take the journey to leave behind their desires, their understandings, their misconceptions and preconceptions, and be open to the understanding that Allah, in this sense, that Simorgh is within them. And children really love this idea of the journey, the concept of 7, but you're moving away from the nafs to the fana, which is annihilation of self within Allah. And then when you explain to them that Simorgh means, morg is Persian for bird, and Sai is Persian for 30, and you then explain to them that 30 birds made the journey and finished it, they really get, and they can write about this really well in essays. The understanding then is that actually the meaning of the story is, don't look for Allah outside of yourself, look for Allah inside of yourself, because that's where Allah is. And then they start to write in their essays how that links to the soul whispers, jugular vein, the idea of zikr, because if I listen, I am remembering through my own mind Allah. So it's bringing all those key ideas together. But fana is a really nice concept. And in fact, there's a quotation from a scholar, Volpe, who says, if Simorgh unveils its face to you, you will find that all the birds are but shadows cast by that unveiling. What shadow is ever separated from its maker? So I am a shadow of Allah, but I'm reflecting Allah in who I am. So in the same way that the bird, the Simorgh, was reflected back to the birds through the mirror, I am a reflection of Allah. And that's exactly what Sufis are trying to get people to understand. And that's why the Sheikh is trying to get them to understand that and to experience it.
I can see why phrases like that may cause some groups to sort of say, oh, that's shirk,
Yes. Yeah.
I can see why that, there's many elements to Sufism. Okay, I can see, that's part of many mainstream ideas as well. But that is one of the particular things I think if I was writing an essay, or if I was teaching about evaluative concepts around this, that might be one of the things that really would be a sticking point for some more traditional, would we say, sort of interpretations of Islam.
I think it very much so. I mean, I remember when I first started teaching at my last school in 2009, and I went there in 2009. And one of my students said to me, I'm a Sufi. I taught about Sufism. No, I'm not a Sufi. That's appalling. I feel really bad to said I was one. But actually, no, it's just what is the core understanding of a Muslim? It's Tawheed, it's the oneness of Allah. Excuse me, Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. That's the core element of it. The core beliefs are still there. It's just how you understand the concept of Tawheed, how you understand the concept of prophethood, how you understand the concept of man's relationship to Allah is really, really important. And I use these 3 concepts really easily, especially actually the last one there, Ruth, I found really nice for the children. Overwhelming awareness of the creator is a key element of fana. So we might say, yes, we talk about obliteration of self, but explain to children that fana is the obliteration of that which stops me seeing myself as part of the universe, that which takes me away from seeing my own role within the universe. And I think that becomes a really different way then to combat this idea of a lot of Muslims saying it's a form of shirk. No, it's about seeing yourself within the universe and your place within the universe as an element of Allah's creation. And in fact, then everything in the universe is a reflection of Allah. So you know, Allah is a transcendent God, and but he's also immanent within there as well. I will see if I've got some actually, Ruth, for you. But as I say, yeah,
I thought someone in the chat might know, Edward, or someone else. But did you want to say something, Edward?
Yeah, just I was interested to know, Ian, have you come across the story of Al-Hallaj, who was executed? He's a contemporary of Junaid, and he was executed in Baghdad because he went around saying, I am the truth. And he was accused of shirk, and the Sharia court pronounced him as having committed shirk in public and didn't desist when he was told not to. And so they executed him. And Junaid said, had I been the judge, I would have given the same ruling.
all right.
And so there's been this huge controversy ever since about whether, what did Junaid mean? Did he mean outward, like Sufism beyond the Sharia and it's valid, but of course the Sharia has to execute him? Or did Junaid mean, no, he actually went too far? Fana is a reality, but you can't say it. So as soon as you say it, it becomes shirk. But as an inward reality that's inexpressible, it may be possible. So that I just wondered, that might be useful to some people. I don't know about.
I think it would be. I've not come across that one before. I mean, when you were saying that, Edward, I was actually thinking, well, by going around saying "I am the truth," I was thinking, which naff is he actually fitting in with there?
Yeah.
I was trying to think, has he actually hit one of the? Is that the self-pleasing naff, or is that one of those? I mean, that's one of the reasons I think that Rumi has used poetry. And I always go back then to that William James idea of the ineffability. Can we really use language to explain this one? And I look at this one, he is a true lover to God, to whom God says, I am thine and thou art mine. Trying to get children to understand the relationship of, love is quite difficult. And we've got that idea there going back to Fana, and this is taken from Rumi. True lovers are as shadows. That actually the true lovers, you can't separate them in any way. They are one and the same. And that's an absolutely key element here of using Rumi's poetry. And I like that one. Eternal life is gained by utter abandonment of one's own life. So the idea is it's about becoming part of Allah, that idea of fana, that end of ego, and seeing my place within this wider creation to do that one. And I think that's why Rumi used so much an idea of love, because love is that complete and total giving of oneself to somebody else, and in deed and in action. And that goes back to the hadith of Jibril there as well. I mean, one of my favorite.
Oh, go on. I was just going to say, because we've got like sort of 10 minutes left, whether we could have some time for questions, or people might ask specific things if there's particular. But I mean, I didn't know what point you were. I was trying to find a good point.
Fine. No, that's no problem.
If there's none, then we can talk more. I've got lots of questions anyway, but you can maybe pop in the chat or unmute if you've got something you want to ask about teaching Sufism. We've got someone who's been teaching this. Talk to us about your results as well. Got a student back again on the call. We had another student as well earlier here as well, which is fantastic. Has anyone got any questions in particular about the teaching of Sufism, or perhaps some of the different views in opposition to it that you want to ask, or you'd like us to help you with? If not, then we can keep going, but I thought I'd give a moment in case people want to ask anything. You can put it in the chat, or I'll stop talking, or not. I guess I could ask, someone asked earlier actually, who are the main groups that might say, or you could type in the chat if you've got something, Gloria, that'd be great. Who are the main groups that we would say would not agree with the Sufi interpretation of Islam? Oh, that was the question, yeah. So what would you say, Ian? Are there particular groups that take quite a strong stance and say, actually, it's not part of Islam, that students could then write about in an exam?
Very much more around the idea. I think Wahhabi Muslims are very much against Sufi Islam. It's not part of, I look back to some of the political things that are happening in the Middle East, not in terms of Gaza and Israel, but elsewhere. The idea of the removal of graves, and the idea of the grave being the idea of remembrance in those ways. So very much around the idea of Muslims who follow, I'd say, Wahhabi Islam, and any development from Wahhabi Islam around, I often find quite a few of the Salafi Muslims will not cope with Sufism in that sense either as well. And in fact, within the community that I was teaching in South Manchester, to say you were Sufi was actually quite a difficult thing for people to do. And to actually say, no, we see something within Sufism. So even for me, teaching it was very much around the idea of, no, this is, we will learn it because it's on the exam, but we don't agree with any of it, and had a lot of discussions there that it was actually shirk. You know, a lot.
So that reminds me of a class we had once at our school who started off with, I remember a colleague saying, oh, I'm not Sufi, we don't do this. And as they went through the lessons and they learnt some of the practices, they were like, oh, actually, my family, we do that. I didn't know that was Sufism. Oh, we do that. And they sort of saw how it was actually very connected, and it might not, that thing about not having a name, but just being part of what Islam is, really resonated with me. Naomi's also asked here, what are some of the common misconceptions that students tend to have about Sufism? And I guess it could be, do you address them at the start? What are some of the things they sort of say that they think Sufism is before you actually teach it?
One of the things I've tended to find is, and it's one of the big issues, is the relationship between Rumi and Shams is a big issue that a lot of students will have, because they will say, well, actually, the idea is, you're using lots of the concepts here of love, and you're talking here, and they will understand it more as a physical understanding of love rather than spiritual understanding of love, and getting children to understand that one. That's I guess Medina Cemetery is a really interesting one, I think. But the idea is it's this understanding of that Sufism is very much a spiritual, beyond the body form of understanding of love. So when you get to things like the reed and the reed bed and say that I am, it's a much more spiritual form of love rather than that physical form of love. Because if you think about the physical form of love, that very much goes with that second valley of the hoop of the Conference of the Birds. And I think that was a key element for them. But also it's a bigger misunderstanding, and it's one that I always used to start my A-level teaching with, is saying that Islam did not develop, even Sunni and Shia Islam did not develop in isolation from what was around it, and getting children to really begin with that understanding then. And one of the things I used to always teach to begin with is the idea of how, and it's what Montgomery Watt used to argue about the development of Islam, is that actually Prophet Muhammad, and one of the questions I used to get for AO2 was Prophet Muhammad a good religious leader or was he a good politician? And the idea was actually he was an amazing politician because he used the tribal understanding of sheikh and companion and tribe and clan and mirrored it perfectly within Islam. And getting children right at the beginning to say that actually you've got to understand that the Islam we have now and the Islam at the time of the Prophet have developed from the historical, religious, social context, and then getting them to understand, therefore, that Sufism is simply a reaction to that. So getting children to understand, because a lot of my children, I don't know if you say, had this huge issue that actually, yes, Prophet Muhammad came with uncompromising monotheism, but within that, monotheism was actually quite common at the time of the Prophet. So in pre-Islamic Arabia, monotheism was quite common. Therefore, this idea of the spiritual side of the union with God, of understanding God in a Sufi sense, is literally nothing new. It's just a development of what people were listening to, were hearing at the time, which is why Rumi, Ibn Arabi argue it's been that key element of Islam from the beginning. And they do go for Sufism as a development later on down the line as a reaction against the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the materialism of the Khalifa. The caliphates that occurred at that time. Actually, no, it's not. Sufism is an integral element of Islam from the beginning. That spiritual understanding of God has always been there. That's what I find as one of the biggest misconceptions. And then they go, typically, they're not Muslims, but they are. Allah is at the center of everything. Muhammad is there. The Quran is still important. Kutub, holy book, is still important, but the interpretation of it is there. And that's when you get to that concept of ijtihad and ijma, and the idea of how do we interpret this? Well, actually, this is, I used to have a great AO2 question, the doors of ijtihad are closed. And the issue was the children were going, right, fine. But actually, for a Sufi, who is interpreting the Quran, the sheikh is for them. And that's when you get into the discussion of the sheikh does it, then you do it yourself, and you understand it yourself through your tariqah. It's just another way to God. It's not a separate way to God. It's a different way to God. And I used to try and get the children to understand then that actually the law schools that develop over time is one way to God, but they become a more acceptable way to Allah because of the traditional understanding that, it's the Sunnah, it's been guided by people discussing it. Well, actually, Sufism not exactly the same. And it's just the idea that it's just trying to understand the Quran in a way where you are reflecting on it rather than looking at hermeneutical study, looking at outside study, and that I think was a key misconception.
Do you think it's easier to sort of, I don't know, I suppose it's the same in all religion, that idea of external actions and external things that you're doing are easier to sort of show and sort of check and know that people are doing it. It's harder to kind of know what's going on in people's hearts around you, isn't it? But you know if they're there next to you. Anyway, I want to give some questions back to the group because I keep hogging a lot for today. So Gloria's asked if you've got any good shortish academic article recommendations, maybe for teachers, maybe for students. And I can I tell you, you're from a different example, a different part of the country. I'm so reassured that you've said lots of names that I know and I've used in my teaching. I'm like, oh, this is great because it makes me feel good about the people we've been using. But have you got any recommendations of any particular articles that would be useful that are kind of short, so students could maybe read it or teachers for their input?
I've got some actually that we've produced in RE today. So what I'll do is I'll send them over to you. So they're designed for teachers and students. When I send everything over, you can send them out to people, Ruth, if you want.
Oh, that'd be great. And I can put them on the Padlet. We have a central Padlet. Anyone is in the chat as well that I put everything up on. That'd be fantastic. I mean, I would keep putting in the chat about an article from Tim Winter, which we used in Justice and Liberation, where he kind of outlines the Wahhabi criticisms of Sufism and how Sufism has been there from the beginning, but he calls it Islamic psychology and the polishing of the heart. And I can't forgetting the name of the title of it, but I'll find that. I've found that really helped me understand a lot more what the debate is that's going on. And in that he talks about how there's different types of bid'ah. And nowadays it's like, oh, it's bid'ah, we can't do it, it's bid'ah, it's bid'ah. He said, well, there's good bid'ah and there's bad bid'ah. There's always been bid'ah, you know. There's always been things that have changed the way you might build a mosque. The eco mosque is bid'ah because it's a new way of doing a mosque. So that's an article that I'll send on as well to everybody. Let's just see any more questions because I'm talking too much. Fantastic. Oh, I'm glad you found the Padlet, Marwa. Amazing. And if anyone on the call, or if you're watching this later and you want to get in touch with me, has an idea for what we should do next, I would be very, very happy. I want it to be something that's useful to us as teachers, useful to the students as well. But you have made me think maybe something on the gates of Ijtihad could be quite a good session to run, couldn't it?
Question trying to get children to understand Ijma and Ijtihad was always, even at because I brought in at GCSE. And the idea was that actually trying to get them to understand that actually one of the key elements of Islam is the fact that you don't accept it blindly, that you do go away, you do think about it, you do interpret it. And this understanding then that became really clear for them, and this is another way we used to think about the one, is actually therefore when we're talking about Islam in Britain today and how the role of the imam, who is not usually from a British background, is influencing the development of British Islam, because their understanding of the Quran is a very much more traditional, from a very much different society to the British Islam. And I think that's why things like, Amina Wadud has had so many issues with her understanding of Islam and trying to understand the Quran from a female point of view and say, this is not my Islam. We need a female law school to do this. And
is there more imams? I suppose there probably is in British mosques that are coming up through who are kind of British and British educated, and I feel like I'm seeing more names and more people that are
and a lot of them are coming from the Dewsbury the law, especially in the conurbations around Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, Liverpool, are going to Dewsbury, and a lot of, my students have gone there. One of my students, Abdullah, who, when I left last year, he's actually gone to Mecca, trained to be an imam. He got a place to be a doctor at university, and brought his parents in, who are both doctors, and said, "Sir, can you have a chat with them because I want to go and learn to be an imam." So he's got now to be an imam.
Oh, fantastic!
But the idea is that the Dewsbury school is very much now trying to say to people, you are speaking to communities who have never lived anywhere other than the major conurbations in the North and the Midlands. Therefore, you must make Islam relevant to them. And this is where we're having some issues then between the different sorts of mosques. And it was a huge issue in Manchester when we had the issue of that. My school was 2 miles from Disbury Mosque. And the arena bomber had come from Disbury Mosque, and they said he'd been radicalised at Disbury Mosque. And he went to my school, which was even more, he didn't, but the news said he did, but it was another school with a similar name to ours. But the idea is it was saying, right, well, what's been taught in this masjid, what's been taught in the Disbury Masjid, what form of Islam is it? And therefore it's like, well, the imam had come from elsewhere, and now they're saying, no, we want an imam from our own community. that's a really interesting one to look at, where they're learning about Islam and where the new generation of imams are coming from. So
so maybe Britain, Islam in Britain. I don't know. What could be our next topic? If you've got any ideas, those of you that's still on the call here, Prashnuda, I don't know if I've met you before online at all. I don't know if you're a student or a teacher, because I know this link was sent out to some students. And Naomi, I don't know where you teach. I think you're a teacher. But if either of you have things you'd like us to talk about in the future, then pop them in the chat. If not, then I'll just take an opportunity to thank you again, Ian, for your time this afternoon.
No problem at all.
I'm going to stop the recording, but I'll just stay with you for a second. So I'll stop the recording.